Right, we're looking at the side of our brain. We have a right side of our brain and a left side of our brain, and we call these hemispheres. We have two hemispheres. This is the left hemisphere. Now, the left hemisphere is important because it deals with our language, and we'll come back to that in a minute. But what I want to point out here is our brain is made up of lobes. It has a frontal lobe, a parietal lobe, an occipital lobe and a temporal lobe. And those are the four main lobes. Within those lobes, within the frontal lobe, we have the prefrontal cortex, we can have our premotor cortex and our motor cortex, and then within the parietal lobe you can see the primary sensory cortex. So within the lobes we can have different areas as well. But remember that there are four main lobes. Now I want to also point out the orange area of our brain, and this is called the cerebellum. Now the cerebellum is important for our motor coordination. It's if you've had too much alcohol, it's what might make you a little bit wobbly. But it is also very important for our language as well, our emotions and our executive functioning. So it is another important area of our brain. Now what's interesting to point out is if this blue bit down here, greeny blue, is our brain stem and it goes up to our medulla oblongata and our pons. This lower end of our brain stem, we call it our reptilian brain because it deals with all our basic functionings. It's what keeps us alive. It deals with our heart rate and our breathing. Without it, we would be in a coma. You would not be here today. And as we go up through our brain into our midbrain that you can't see here but is within here, we have what we call our limbic system, and that deals with all of our emotions. So our brain is very complicated, and the further you get up towards the frontal cortex, and we call this part the frontal lobe, the prefrontal cortex, we are dealing with far more complex cognitive processes. So it is our frontal lobe, and particularly this area, our prefrontal cortex, which deals with our complex decision making. Now I'm going to break it down for you a bit here. We're going to start with the back of the brain, our occipital lobe. Now if we think of our eyes being at the front where my mouth is wibbling about here, these are our eyes. Now information comes in through our eyes and goes through our brain to our occipital lobe, and our occipital lobe will deal with all our visual processing information. Now when we're talking about sensory information and we're talking about perception, all the information coming through what we touch, predominantly what we smell, but that can be a bit complicated, goes through to our parietal lobe. So think of that as our sensory lobe. We can think of our temporal lobe as our auditory information cortex, where we process auditory information. It's above our ear, and so it's quite easy to remember. Temporal lobe is to do with hearing because it's above our ear. Now our temporal lobe is also important because it's to do with our memory, and it houses what we call the hippocampus, and it's our hippocampus that deals with all that processing of our memory and storing it within our long-term memory. It's also important because it houses a very important area for language called our Wernicke's area. Our Wernicke's area, which is a very important part of understanding language. Now our frontal lobe is incredibly important. It does all our short-term memory, does all our higher ordered thinking. It's what gives us our personality. It's what allows us to do creative thinking and divergent thinking. It is also important in language because it is our Broca's area. It is how we produce language. Now Broca and Wernicke's area are related and they are intertwined and they are connected, and there is a video about those and the importance of those for language. What I do want to touch on though is areas of the brain important for developmental disabilities, particularly for autism. Our cerebellum, this bit at the back here, what we're talking about is our motor coordination, language, emotion and executive functioning. We are consistently finding increased volumes of cerebellum within children who have ASD, which is interesting. Now, within inside our brain here, we're talking about our limbic system to do with our emotions, and our amygdala, we can see, is all about emotion. It's about our social behavior, and again, this is different in children. It is smaller in children with autism than it is in typically developing children. Now we see particularly amygdala, which is to do with our fear responses as well, our emotions, our social behavior. In serial killers, our amygdalas can be small as well. And when we're talking about ADHD as well, we can see that emotional response, that inhibition is to do with our amygdala as well. Now we're talking about ADHD, we can talk about our prefrontal cortex, the area of our frontal lobe, and it just seems that this is to do with attention, it's to do with executive functioning, it's to do with organisation. Again, this area for children who have ADHD is inhibited, and we can see the different areas of the brain are having an effect on these children developmentally. Particularly, there's some interesting research on Broca's area in children with ASD and language impairment, and they were found that this area in particular has deficits when it comes to children who have autism. Now, when we're looking at things like dyslexia, the way in which the brain is formed, those genetic mutations affect the left temporal lobe. The left lobe is to do with language. It also affects our occipital lobe, the way in which we process visual information. So if we're talking about reading and looking at letters and spelling, this then maps on to our visual system and the way in which we pronounce our words, our Broca's area. So we can see how developmental disabilities and our brain are highly linked, and we need to understand the areas of the brain in order to understand how we can help these disabilities.